Welcome to everyone who has joined us for this conversation about the role of religious communities in a time of crisis. My name is Amy Miracle, and I'm going to be the convener as well as a participant in the panel today. First, I want to say a little bit about the sponsor of this event, the Association of Marshall Scholars. It's a 501(c) with roughly 2,000 Marshall Scholar members. It's dedicated to strengthening the relationships between the United States and the United Kingdom through investing in scholarship programs, exchanges, and of course the Marshall Scholarship program that many of us are familiar with and I'm very grateful for. Just one note about our presentation today. The last 15 minutes of our time together will be devoted to questions and answers. And please send us any questions you may have through the Q&A function, which should be on the bottom of the screen. You all have our bios, so we will keep our introductions short and focus on our time as a Marshall, as the thing that binds the three of us together and many of us who are on having this experience today. And I'll go ahead and start. I was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, studying Irish political history at Queen's University. And at the time, I believe I was the first scholar who had been placed at Queen's in quite a while. And I had a marvelous time. Sue, I'll hand off to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sue Reinhold. I was a Marshall Scholar in 1988, and I completed a DPhil in social anthropology at the University of Sussex. So I too was at one of those other universities, the plate glass university, and I'm happy to be here with you today.
Yusufi.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon here from the East Coast. I know Sue's on the West Coast, so it's the morning there. I was in London at SOAS and then at LSC. And I had a fantastic time. It was a very interesting experience, particularly being South Asian, in the UK, as it's as you all know, a minority that's of a very different socioeconomic status than here in America, and of course Muslim, post 9/11 and some of the attacks in London as well. So,
excellent, thanks, and welcome to both of you. First question, this is billed as discussing religious communities and their response to crisis. And how would you define the crisis we are facing today? And living in Northern California, Sue, I'll ask you to start.
Oh, wow. You can put me on the spot. The air quality today is okay, much better than it's been in the past few weeks. So, I kind of start there and maybe work back. We have a climate crisis in California, clearly, as the earth gets drier. And we also have a health crisis that is a global pandemic. And I lived in London and Brighton at the height of the AIDS crisis. And was out, at the time. So I'm taken back to another pandemic that we all lived through in the 80s and all the way into the mid 90s. And there's a crisis in our political economy. I'm speaking to people who have studied in Britain, which is a place I think where it's readily accepted that there is such a thing as a political economy. In the United States, it's not necessarily as accepted a term. But we have a fractured polity, and those three things all kind of on top of each other make life is stressful these days, and I'm glad we're talking about it.
Yusufi, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think in terms of I think Sue's covered it, but the fractured polity, I think I think of that in two ways. One is just the polarization that exists right now in America, and there is in my opinion, in that polarization, I feel there's a little bit of a crisis of character as well. You know, and I mean, I think it's epitomized by our president, but I think he in many ways is a reflection of you know, the if in our tradition we'd say the diseases of the heart that exist, you know, out in our polity. So I think that that's one piece of it, and obviously I think what also Sue's referring to is you know, this crisis around race in America that's really come to the head, and so it's a very interesting, I think, time to be living, because with crisis, as we all know, there's huge potential for change, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I think I would add, and I'm the pastor of a community, so in some ways my my scope is small and very particular and very local. And I think if you were to ask most of our folks what is the crisis of the day, they would first name kind of the twin crises of a pandemic, and also the ongoing issues around racial equity and racial justice. That those would be the primary ones that they would name. Although I love the complexity that you both added to that page. What are some of the primary ways in which your religious communities are addressing those?
So you just cut out. I missed the last part of that question. Sorry.
Oh, Amy. Yeah. What are the
Amy, sorry.
No, what are some of the primary ways in which your religious communities are addressing the crises?
Sue, do you want to
go? Well, you know, there's you know, I think each of our religious tradition, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, provide marvelous operating systems for both personal and communal, the creation of personal and communal meaning, resilience, and strength. And so what I'm finding is a longstanding volunteer in the Jewish community, as well as more recently a Jewish professional, where I've sat in my perch at the Jewish Federation in San Francisco for the last 3 years, is you know, in the pandemic, which is the crisis that's most in front of us most recently, and it is enormous. We've seen an enormous outpouring of support into the local community. And I say that the Bay Area, you know, the Bay Area community, the multiple communities in the Bay Area, as and even as they're, you know, because of the models of Jewish community are related to, you know, donations and membership in different communities, even as the Jewish communal institutions themselves, Jewish community centers, which have fees for membership, you know, are going through a big financial crisis. So the disruption is really severe, and the community is really stepping up to support everyone. That's one way to answer the question. There's lots of ways in.
Yeah.
What do you think, Yusufi?
You know, I certainly, now that I'm in government, I'm seeing that role that religious communities are playing, of one of really connecting folks that need resources, and yeah, definitely seeing that piece about religious institutions really being challenged. And I'll say particularly our Black faith institutions have been extremely challenged during this time, because of the disparities within COVID. The other interesting thing that I think that is happening or has been happening in the Muslim community is, you know, there is a real core value within our faith around racial equality, right? The Prophet Muhammad actually, in his final sermon, said that, you know, and I'm quoting it, that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, and also non-Arab has no superiority over an Arab, and a white has no superiority over a black, and a black doesn't have a superiority over white. And so and then you look at examples in the tradition. I mean, the person he'd assigned to do the call to prayer that you hear 5 times a day was Bilal, who's Ethiopian, who we would consider, in our language, black, right? Or after the Prophet Muhammad's mother died, his next caretaker was Umayman, who was also Abyssinian and who we describe as black. So there's just this profound value in our tradition around it, and yet the Muslim community, 33% of it is African American. The rest of it is largely first and second generation here in America. And yet we know that we have not lived up to that value here in America of treating our African American brothers and sisters equally within the context and institutions of our community, and particularly that critiques at the Arabs and South Asian parts of our community, because as we've kind of immigrated into this country, we have also inherited that disease of racism in us, and those judgments that a lot of white America makes. And so there's been a real robust conversation around that within our community, a lot of back and forth. There's been some pain in that conversation, which has just been healthy. And my hope is that those conversations will continue in a way that we as a community will begin to live up to the values that we're meant to. So that's been a big way that it's played out. What about you, Amy?
I loved your use of the phrase, and yet, that we're having an and yet moment in our religious communities. We have these values that at our best, we have these values that lead us towards equity and justice. And yet, those values have not always shaped our communities, let alone shaped the ways in which we interact with the world. So my next question, and the three of us had a little bit of a pre-conversation a few days ago, and we got talking about kind of generational differences in our communities. One thing that I have been so in awe of in my community here in Columbus, Ohio, when I look at the movement, the current movement for justice around racial issues, the strongest leaders are in their 20s. They are youth and young adults, many of whom are motivated by their religious values, yet not acting out. They are not operating out of the institutions that gave them those values. So I wondered if either of you wanted to comment on that phenomenon.
I mean, I'll jump in. There's a very there are many educational strands for youth in the Jewish community. Everything from synagogue, religious school, to Jewish camp, to summer camp, and you name it. There's lots and lots of ways that Jewish education permeates, and the kids are learning these fantastic Jewish values around tikkun olam, making the world a better place, pursuing justice. Tzedek tirdot, the Torah says you must pursue justice, and pursuit like you pursue, like a lover, love interest, that kind of hot pursuit of justice, and now we, what mainstream institutions are really being left behind to a certain extent in terms of where the youth are leading us politically. You definitely see that in these kind of, in California, I think, these fantastically diverse, multiracial, Jewish coalitions in partnership with Black Lives Matter And there's a story. There's an old Jewish story about this three sages are having an argument, and they're arguing some point or another, and God's actually there at the argument, and God keeps trying to intervene and saying, yeah, but what about this? What about this? And the sages are saying, forget, we don't care what you think. We're arguing this point. Of course, with the values that came from the deity, and God just starts laughing and says, my children have defeated me. And I think we're seeing some of that, where you can kind of work at a large communal Jewish institution and have really wonderfully Jewishly educated 20-somethings standing outside that institution holding picket signs.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, one of the questions that we had thought about addressing was the ways in which the religious community is taking leadership in this movement. And I think the three of us kind of like to flip that around and say, what can our religious communities, particularly our institutions, learn from this movement in terms of looking at how they're structured, who has leadership, how leadership is shared, the leadership roles that are being filled by people of color. To me, it feels like a time for so many of our organizations and institutions to take a back seat or to take a step back and allow others to step up and lead, and for us to learn from them. And I know in my case, my daughter is one of those youth, and I'm just trying to keep up. And that's a challenge these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that it's a very similar dynamic within particularly the immigrant Muslim community, where we're starting to see kids that have grown up here begin to really bring their parents along in this conversation, and really educate them, and it's just really been profound to kind of see that piece. The other piece that I think has been a beautiful learning, I think, for our community is really trying to center our African American brothers and sisters' voices during this time and follow their lead, which just to be very frank, unfortunately hasn't been the case in the broader Muslim community, and so I really taking their lead, really trying to listen, learn, and it was so interesting because within this dynamic, I mean, one of our leaders in the American Muslim community is this African American Imam Dawood Walid. And as the protests were going on, one of the things that he said was, look, I know it's like cool, chic, to go out there and start protesting, but actually what I would really like you all to do is take the time out to really build a relationship with your African American Muslim brother in your locale and spend time doing that, so you really understand what's happening here before you just willy-nilly go out to the protest, which was just really an interesting perspective for me, and it's something that I think a number of us are trying to follow and hopefully sustain in the long term. I mean, that kind of work on this issue.
Absolutely. Another thing that I found so interesting and in some ways poignant is this is a time when many of us in religious communities are not doing our primary activity in the buildings. Mm-hmm. That we've been dispersed, and my own community, I think others are trying to see that not as primarily a negative, but to see the positive side of that. And in this moment when the energy of, in our language we'd say God's Spirit, seems to be at work outside the buildings, and actually in the communities and on the streets. I had the experience of being part of a march from the part of town I live in to the Capitol, and it took us right by the church I serve, and I realized that, all this energy was going right by the church, and there were people all over the church building, kind of on the steps and kind of almost hanging from the rafters on the outside of the building with signs, and the building felt very much a part of the community, but the energy was all coming from outside the building.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you, Amy, on religion leaving the building and going out kind of onto the streets. I think American churches are probably much in the same situation that synagogues in the United States. Lots of them are a lot. The average age is a lot older than it was a generation ago. The demographics in synagogues are a lot wider than the demographics are out on the streets or amongst the so-called unaffiliated Jews, the Jews who don't belong to a religious community. And I'm recalling from a wonderful book called A Stone of Hope about the American Civil Rights Movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and a Jewish activist going down to Mississippi and meeting, and they're organizing for voter rights, voter registration, and gets into a conversation with Fannie Lou Hamer, who says to him, well, you just have to understand that religion is really serious business here, because he come from like the Northeast or somewhere like that, and the the premise of this book, Stone of Hope, is that the American Civil Rights Movement was in part successful because it was a prophetic religious movement, and because it got people not just here, that civil rights and the end of Jim Crow was a good idea, but it got people in their hearts and in their, what we say in Yiddish, their kishkis, in their guts, that, and it moved them to get out onto the streets and to get busy.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. I'm going to pull up a question that we've received already through the chat. So much of life since the pandemic started is happening online. How can religious communities use their voices to create changes in the status quo of online hate and misinformation? Either of you want to tackle that?
Well, I'm now in government, so I'm going to defer to both of you. I'm going to take the easy one on this one, and then maybe react to what you all have to say.
So I'll just, I think it comes back to what Yusufi said about the imam who said, get into relationship with your brother, get into relationship with your sister, and I'll tell you, after the synagogue shootings in Pittsburgh, spontaneously I wound up leading a Shiva service at the foot of Lake Merritt in Oakland, California, and it was so important to be in community that night, and it wasn't just Jews who showed up. It was people who were mourning that this kind of hate was manifest in the world. And I don't have an easy answer for how we do that kind of work together when we're staring at each other on these little Brady Bunch screens all day, because I'll kind of put the question back to you two. We've come to know each other a little bit in these two conversations, but I have yet to look either of you truly in the eye. And I'll take a statement from the forefather Jacob, who when he met his estranged brother Esau after 20 years of being away from him, and Esau had wanted to kill him the last time they were in the same town together, he said to Esau, to look at your face is to look at the face of God. And that's the value of being in the same room and being in relationship together. So you can see that spark of the divine in a fellow human being, and it's very hard to do on flat screens.
I think I'm going to take a little different attack with this, and certainly as a specific small religious community, we can't take on misinformation, and that's just such a big topic. But the kind of strand of American religious history that we're a part of, I'm a Presbyterian, we're part of the Reformed tradition, and we are a part of the Protestant tradition that believes in the importance of critical thinking. We've just always been self-reflective, and think the more you know and think, the stronger your religious tradition is, and it makes us people, and we all make fun of ourselves often that we're a little less warm than some other traditions and a little nerdier, but it's also in many ways our gift to the communities we're a part of, that you can be a people of deep faith and have deep roots in religious tradition, and also think critically about our own tradition, our own role in our society, and about everything. And for me, embracing and creating and affirming critical thinking is just really important, and not something that it's not something we can do in a remedial way, but something we need to do, week in, week out, year in, year out. So there's my little plug for my little corner of the Christian world.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe coming off of that, I mean, from my perch now in government, I do think that religious communities and religious leadership in particular can play a really important role in creating the space for really honest conversation around race, and I think that's just so important on this issue. I'll just speak here in Boston. It was just really profound because the city actually does these calls with our faith leaders every 3 to 4 weeks, and just the quality of conversation and openness and honesty and integrity with which our white, Black, and immigrant clergy were beginning to have that conversation was pretty profound. And so I do think religious leadership can model how to begin to have this conversation around race, which we know as a country we have not figured it out, which is part of the reason we can't move beyond this, And so my hope would be that clergy can play a critical role in sustaining this as the media moves on from this, and as attitudes start to return to where they were before, the George Floyd video, and now the Jacob Blake video. We are going to move on. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't the case, but we are going to move on. And so I think clergy just have a real critical role to play in that. And I think if that conversation is able to happen, and there is solidarity built around a common agenda that's obviously led by our Black brothers and sisters, I think there is a profound opportunity for change. Because again, I'll tell you, in government, it is interesting that even in as a secular town as Boston, right, clergy have a particular kind of standing in the city. And so I think there is a huge potential role, but there's a lot of work internally that needs to be done before we can get to that space.
One of the podcasts I love to listen to is called Death, Sex, and Money. And they always introduce it by saying, you know, these are the things that we know we want to talk about more, but are afraid to. And I always think when it comes to the church, and I'll speak for the church, we've always been pretty good at honest conversation around death, you know, the reality of death and grief and all that surrounds it. We've gotten better about talking about money and resources, and that includes the climate and all. We clearly probably need to do a better job of talking honestly about sex, and we've been working on that and now we're adding to that list race. Something that in many of our communities we have not talked about and have not created those spaces for honest conversations. And part of that is certainly as we've always been often been reminded that the Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours in the United States. So I think you're exactly right. One of the most challenging things and one of the greatest things about religious communities is we tend to kind of stay where we're at. We're around for a while. We're rooted in geography and time and place. And that can make it tough for us to change, but it also means we're in it for the long haul. And may we be in this conversation for the long haul.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
May that be so. May that be so.
Amen.
Yeah. I wonder if you want to say a little bit more, switching focus just a little bit, on what your religious communities, how your religious communities are responding to the realities of the pandemic. And I'm thinking particularly in this month and at this particular moment, the challenges faced by everyone involved with education, from K through post-grad, families, educators, school board members, administrators. Wondered kind of what your thoughts are on that question.
So I'll jump in. An extraordinary amount of Jewish learning has moved online. So much so that I think there's somebody said the other day, we're in a golden age of Jewish content. It is everywhere all the time. It's now all free, and you don't have to actually physically leave your home to learn and participate. And again, I think then the kind of richness and complexity of what's available is astounding. I mean, really astounding. And yet that one-on-one conversation, counsel, people's access to pastoral care in a setting where there's a loneliness, isolation. I don't think that my religious community, just speaking broadly, has really solved for that. If I'm not setting foot in my religious community physically and having a few words with my rabbi and making sure I'm touching base with a couple of people who I know, might not be doing so well, how do we replicate that?
Yeah.
I think the Muslim community has been in a challenging spot around its education, partly because our institutions are so young in this country, and so many of them are financially strapped as it is. I mean, I know when we were talking before in our prep session, the Muslim community is where the Jewish community in many ways was in the 1920s and 30s. So I think that the pandemic has really, really impacted our institutions' ability to really continue and and move forward. So in many ways, I think the Muslim community is looking at how the discourse is playing out just generally in American life around this. And this is where I think, you know, a big role that faith has had to play, and clergy are having to play, is a pastoral role around helping people appreciate and understand that everyone is going to have different kind of decisions that they're going to need to make in respect to you know, how, whether they're going to have their kids stay at home or send them to public school, and not to get caught up in the politics of what we're seeing playing out nationally, and just for there to be compassion and empathy, because, you know, I mean, there's a good friend of mine who lost his father to COVID. So obviously his approach to schools and sending his kids is going to be a lot more conservative, and for very good reasons, than, you know, someone that just hasn't been touched. And so, you know, helping people understand why people are coming from different perspectives, I think is a critical role that I think clergy can play. So really the pastoral piece is so important.
One of the messages that we have been saying in my particular community to everyone involved with education in the last month, it's been real simple. We see you, we support you, we love you. God sees you, God supports you, God loves you. We've been just trying to say that in multiple places. The other thing I kind of gently said in a sermon was, for those of you who don't have skin in this game right now, let's just keep our opinions to ourselves. That these decisions are agonizing enough without those of us on the sidelines making helpful suggestions about what folks should and shouldn't do, because it's agonizing and it's traumatic, as we all walk our way through this fall.
Just one thing, you know, speaking of trauma, by the way, Amy, I think, particularly early on in the pandemic, but I mean, I think it still is the case in so many parts of the country, when you've had a loved you know, a family member pass away during COVID, I mean, and not being able to be there physically when that's happened, I have to say that has been some of the most difficult you know, moments that I've been with some of our friends and family that have lost someone. And I do think that, again, pastoral care during that moment has been so important for families. I mean, in our tradition, and I think this is the case with the Christian Jewish tradition, but, you know, we believe that when a person dies out of COVID, that, I mean, there's strong kind of scholarly opinion that that person is a martyr, actually, in faith, and that even if the family's not there, angels are present in that moment, and they are washing the body, you know, and playing that moment, that comfort, that role of comfort, and I think that has given people a lot of solace that have been in that particular situation. But it's that has been so gut-wrenching to watch and to be a part of.
That's a great transition to a question we have in the chat. Someone wrote, a crisis of connection. This spans the political, the health, and the personal. Cut off physically, emotionally, economically, and in viewpoint from one another, we are also removed from the communal, social, ritual, and institutional supports built over millennia to get through crises. What are the models of response to emulate when we move past the specific manifestations you described? Beautifully worded question. And I know as a pastor of a congregation, for the first month or two, we were really in crisis management, and also, this won't last too long, we'll just postpone all of our rituals. And then it became apparent month 2 or 3 that was maybe not a good long-term strategy. And part of the challenge, and also in some ways the joy of the last few months has been, how can we take the best of those traditions and those rituals and creatively figure out how to do them in this current moment, and invite our people to be in partnership with us as we figure that out, so that we find we're doing more of our rituals in ways we never imagined we would do them. But we're trying to figure that out, and that has felt, it's felt like we're doing it together. We're figuring it out together, and coming up with some things that are actually pretty positive. I mean, I find I've gone back, for example, our baptismal liturgy, and in many ways I've rewritten it, and now it reflects, kind of the deepest understanding that this community has about who they are and who God is and who we are in the world. And we kind of did that because we needed to figure it out again in this moment. And part of it for me is, I now preach to my iPhone. For a Sunday sermon, I am preaching to myself, a picture of myself on my iPhone, which is a very different experience than I'm used to. And it involves a huge amount of trust. And this, it's like this creative leap, that both God is present in this experience as ever, because God is big and powerful and bigger than this pandemic, and also trusting that I am a part of a community that is resilient, and creative, and also shares that belief in this big, powerful God who is finding new ways to be with us and new ways to hold us together. Sorry, little mini sermon there.
That was beautiful.
But that's been part of the project of the last few months, and one that at the end of the day, I find much of that life-giving, as much as I wish we were not in this place, in that we did not need to respond to the suffering of this moment. But I've also felt that God has been with us in that kind of upending and in that creativity.
I love what you said about upending. I think in our Jewish community, I think we knew who we were 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure we know who we are today. And the crisis is these various crises have provided a quickening of that question. Who are we? And there are people in the room who were not in the room 30 years ago. The Jewish community is much more multiracial than many community leaders give it credit for. We're now having the courage to have conversations we weren't having 30 years ago, or even 5 years ago, even 1 year ago. And I'm struck by this idea, and again, with death hanging over us, I'm struck by the parallels with the book of the Exodus and the Israelites getting out from under Pharaoh and getting out into a place where they could be free. And they're described as leaving Egypt as a mixed multitude. Now that could mean all kinds of things. That could mean, multiracial coalition. That, this is a ragtag group of slaves or itinerant workers, and who knows who was in that mix. They were mixed up because everything was so topsy-turvy. And in fact, death had been hanging over them. And I am really, thinking a lot about the political theorist, Michael Walzer, who wrote a excellent book called Exodus and Revolution. And, his contention is that the story of the Exodus is a template for all of Western kind of political history, the history of Western political change. And it strikes me, this moment is a moment for that model, because he ends this book saying that no matter where you are right? Us today. You're probably in Egypt. And there exists somewhere out there a promised land, which is a better place. And the only way to get there is by walking through the wilderness. And so the thing we should probably do is join hands and start marching. And I think we're challenged as religious leaders to kind of help that forward motion happen.
Just, one thing that I want to kind of flip a little bit in terms of this question is that we're kind of coming with the framework that connection is absolutely critical, and I in our tradition, companionship is so core. But I do want to say that there is great wisdom in our traditions for seclusion, right? That is a practice also within our traditions. And I know in the Islamic tradition, there's this notion of khalwa, which is seclusion, and Prophet Muhammad used to go to the cave, and he actually received revelation in cave. I think of Moses' example, which is a big story within the Quran as well, where he's going up to the mountain. And so I also think that there is an opportunity for spiritual growth for us to now be disconnected from some of our connections, from being cut off from some of our materialistic concerns and consumerist kind of habits, right? And the pandemic has forced that on us. And so I know that a number of Muslim leaders have been also preaching on that theme, that, look, this is almost a forced khalwa, and that there's an opportunity for you to build a much deeper connection with God, with Allah, and really reflect and recenter your life now. And so in this hardship, there's potentially a form of great growth.
It's interesting. I've heard from particularly some of the families in the congregation that have children, school-age children, that taking a step back from the busyness culture has been a gift to them. Mm-hmm. But I'm also keying off a question that someone posed about those who may be isolated during this time sometimes because of technology, that they're not able to access technology either because of age or kind of expertise or financial reasons. And one thing that's been really clear in our congregation is we have some folks who were overwhelmed with the complexities of life before the pandemic and are even more overwhelmed now, who are two parents working, kids doing online schooling, and it is a kind of an avalanche of responsibilities. And then we have a segment of the congregation that's drowning in isolation. Mm-hmm. And those are two very different experiences. And I know for us, we've tried to minister to both, and particularly those that we think are not able to connect through technology. We're trying to use really old school stuff. I mean, I think many of us have rediscovered the telephone. It's like you can actually talk to people on it, and also cards. Like children and youth sending cards to older vulnerable adults has been another. But figuring out how to kind of hold all that at the same time and speak to both of those groups, I think has been part of the challenge of religious communities in this particular moment. One of the questions was whether there was a particular text from our tradition that is either sustaining us or challenging us during this time.
Happy to go on this one. So for me, it's actually more of a concept that's core to our faith, and it's this concept of qad and bast in Arabic. Qad is constriction or constriction or hardship, and then bast is expansion or ease. And it comes from the verse in the Quran that Wallahu yaqbidu wa yabsitu وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ, which means that God contracts and he expands, and to him you shall return, which this notion of constriction expansion for me has two elements to it. One is it's just a recognition the life of this world is always going to be up and down, and so it's just a recognition within our tradition that if you are expecting the life in this world to be, always up, that's just not the reality of this world. That's why there's a heaven, in the next life. But the other piece that's really profound about this is particularly this notion of constriction and hardship, is that in our faith we are taught that that a growth happens through both constriction and expansion. And actually, when the Prophet Muhammad first received revelation, he felt a great constriction. He felt like he was being squeezed, and he actually feels it 3 times, and then before revelation, starts coming to him, and he's able to. So that to me has been a framework that I've been trying to apply to the situation that we've been in, which is we as, I think, individuals, because of COVID, as you were just describing, Amy, are facing a lot of constriction and hardship, and the same is for our nation. And as we know, we're taught in our faith traditions, really, how do you respond to that? And that response is often what indicates the kind of growth, your ability to meet your true, spiritual potential, if you will. And so, and I think that's at an individual level that, we're facing that, and obviously at a level, at the national level, as an American polity, we're facing that. And I think it's, we'll see how we respond to that and see how we come out to that. But that's something I've tried to keep front and center for myself.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
One of the stories, and I just want to thank both of you. That's going to be a sermon I'm going to preach. And so I'm already preaching a sermon on your interpretation of the Exodus narrative. One story that's been challenging me and maybe comforting me as well recently is it's a story about Jesus, where a woman who's not Jewish, who's a Syrophoenician, comes up to him and asks him to heal her daughter. And he says, no, I don't have time for you. And he basically he calls her a dog. He says, I'm only here for my people. I don't have time for you. And the woman responds and says, well, even the dogs under the table get some of the scraps. Mm. And then Jesus says, because of your faith, I'm going to heal you. And I've read and reread that story. And Jesus is responding. Even Jesus has absorbed the categories of his culture. Yeah. Mm. Even Jesus was not able to completely rise above that. And I've been thinking about that as, when we encounter the folks who come from a different background or are different in other, and we have a conversation with them, we end up saying stupid things. And Jesus said a stupid thing. But he stayed in it until somebody got healed. And I've just been wrestling with that as a different kind of story to shape our life moving forward. Sue, anything you want to add?
There's a beautiful little piece of Deuteronomy that talks about the Torah, which is funny because part of the Torah is the book of Deuteronomy. And so it's kind of like the Torah referring to itself, and which is, it does from time to time. And it says, the instructions for a good life and the instructions for a good society, this Torah, this teaching, is it over across the mountains, or is it over across the ocean? And the answer is no. It's right here in your heart, so that you can say it. It's in your heart and in your mouth, that you can say it and do it. And that helps me. That helps me a lot. That in this period where we could kind of feel alone, that it's right here for us to say and do. And an itinerant preacher who was teaching around the time of Jesus also said it around that same era. And this goes back to something that you were just talking about, Amy, which is, we are never going to complete the work of making the world a perfect place, the best place it can be. But that doesn't mean we have any type of excuse to desist from doing the work. And that's where we're at. The world is imperfect and messy, and I'm really pleased that I get to be in the work with the two of you.
I think that's a perfect place for us to end today. It is such an honor and has been so much fun spending time with the two of you. I want to thank all the people who made time to be a part of this conversation today, especially those who contributed questions. I apologize we didn't get to them. Such thoughtful, important questions. But as you said, Sue, this work continues. The conversation continues. I want to thank our friend behind the scenes, Elitzer, who imagined this event and did all the hard work of getting us together, and has been wonderful in running this event from behind the scenes. Thank you, David. And blessings to all of you as you continue in this work and as you go about your day.
Amy, thank you for facilitating this as well.
Yeah,
Thank
you. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, blessings to all.
Pleasure.
Great. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Ciao.